In this episode, we're going to focus on one of the most frustrating failure modes in cloud security, which is when everyone believes encryption is protecting sensitive data, but a quiet misconfiguration leaves a gap that nobody notices. This is not the kind of failure that triggers an obvious outage or flashes a warning light, because systems can keep working normally while security is quietly weakened. Cloud services often make encryption feel automatic, and that convenience is valuable. Yet it can also mask the reality that encryption depends on workflows, defaults, policies, and permissions that can drift or be overridden. The danger is not only that encryption could be turned off, but that parts of the data lifecycle could slip outside the encrypted path, like exports, replicas, temporary files, or newly created resources that do not inherit the expected settings. The goal is to learn how misconfigurations silently disable security, why they happen so often, and how to design your environment so encryption failures become harder to create and easier to detect. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful way to think about encryption in cloud platforms is as a chain of decisions rather than a single switch, because the chain is where misconfigurations hide. At one link in the chain, a service needs to know whether to encrypt data at rest, which key to use, and what policy controls key usage. At another link, data may move between services, be processed, or be cached, and those steps require consistent protection so plaintext is not exposed in unexpected places. At another link, teams may create new resources, copy data, or change settings under time pressure, and those actions can bypass the intended encryption workflow. The chain can be broken by small choices that seem harmless, like a default not being applied in a particular creation path, or a permission that allows a workflow to fall back to weaker behavior. The reason this matters is that encryption's promise is only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. Once you see encryption as a workflow, not a feature, you are better prepared to protect it. Silent encryption failures often start with the assumption that the platform will handle everything automatically, which is true only up to a point. Many services encrypt by default, but default behavior can differ based on region, service type, resource age, or the method used to create the resource. A team might create resources through a console in one case and through automation in another, and the outcomes can differ in ways that are easy to miss. Another silent failure happens when a service reports encryption enabled, but the setting applies only to certain data elements or only to certain storage layers. That means the status can be technically accurate while still leaving sensitive fields or secondary copies less protected than expected. A third silent failure is when encryption exists, but key usage boundaries are so broad that any compromised identity can retrieve plaintext through normal service access. The consistent theme is that silence comes from normal-looking operation, not from an absence of risk. One common misconfiguration pattern is partial coverage, where the primary dataset is protected but the supporting artifacts are not. Backups, snapshots, exports, logs, and cached copies are often created as part of normal operations, and those copies can contain the same sensitive information as the primary system. If those artifacts are stored in a different location, created by a different workflow, or governed by a different policy set, encryption coverage can become inconsistent without anyone noticing. This is especially dangerous because secondary copies often have weaker access controls and longer retention, making them attractive to attackers. In the real world, people also share data for troubleshooting or analytics, and those shared copies can become the path where plaintext escapes. The best prevention is to design encryption expectations that apply across the data lifecycle, not just to the main storage service. When you protect the entire lifecycle, you reduce the chance that a hidden copy becomes the weakest link. Another quiet failure mode is fallback behavior, where a system degrades to a weaker path when the intended encryption path is blocked. For example, if a service cannot use the expected key because of a policy problem, a poorly designed workflow might allow a different key, a default key, or a less controlled mechanism to be used so the system keeps running. This is tempting because it avoids operational disruption, but it also creates exactly the silent failure we are trying to prevent because the environment appears healthy while protection has weakened. A safer design treats key usage failure as a serious event, not as a reason to silently choose a weaker option. This is where Key Management System, KMS, design matters, because the key policies and the permissions around them should be strict and predictable, and failures should be visible and actionable. In strong environments, failures that would weaken encryption do not happen quietly, because quiet failures are the enemy of trust. If something cannot be encrypted as expected, you want the system and your processes to make that obvious. Misconfigurations also creep in through access control, because encryption workflows depend on identities being allowed to use keys and services being allowed to operate correctly. When permissions are too broad, encryption can be effectively bypassed through legitimate access to decrypted data, which looks normal in logs unless you know what to watch for. When permissions are too narrow in the wrong place, teams may add emergency exceptions that widen access in unsafe ways, and those exceptions often linger. Identity and Access Management, IAM, is therefore part of protecting encryption workflows because it determines which identities can create resources, change encryption settings, use keys, and retrieve data. A strong approach makes key usage permissions narrowly scoped to specific application identities, makes administrative key changes rare and governed, and reduces standing privilege for humans. It also ensures that sensitive changes require strong authentication, such as multi-factor authentication, MFA, because encryption settings and key policies are too important to protect with weak sign-in practices. When identity governance is tight, encryption workflows are less likely to be weakened by convenience decisions. Another subtle risk is inconsistent enforcement, where the organization has a policy that says everything must be encrypted, but the environment does not have guardrails that force that policy to be true. People often rely on training and checklists to enforce encryption, but training and checklists do not scale as well as automation and policy enforcement. In cloud environments, encryption must be treated as a baseline requirement that is enforced at creation time and validated continuously, because drift is constant. If teams can create unencrypted resources without immediate friction, some unencrypted resources will eventually exist, especially during fast-moving projects. That does not always happen because people are careless, but because cloud systems offer many pathways to create and copy resources, and one overlooked pathway becomes the weak spot. Strong organizations build enforcement that prevents insecure states from being created in the first place, or at least flags them immediately. The goal is to make it hard to accidentally create data outside the encryption workflow. Visibility is what turns silent failures into detectable failures, and visibility starts with knowing what to measure. If encryption is a workflow, then measurement needs to check coverage across resource types, environments, and lifecycle artifacts, not just a single configuration flag. Measurement should also verify key policy alignment, such as whether sensitive datasets use the intended keys, whether key usage permissions match expected roles, and whether encryption settings are consistent across new and existing resources. The point is not to drown in metrics, but to choose a few high-confidence signals that reveal meaningful gaps. For example, you want to know whether any sensitive storage is unencrypted, whether any backups are stored outside encryption expectations, and whether any keys are used in ways that do not match the approved workflows. You also want measurements that can be repeated regularly, so you can detect drift and not just take one snapshot. When visibility is consistent, misconfigurations have less time to hide. A related concept is evidence, because the ability to prove encryption is working is different from the desire to believe it is working. Evidence includes configuration records that show encryption settings, key policy records that show who can use keys, and usage records that show how keys and data access are actually being exercised. Evidence matters because audits, incidents, and internal reviews often happen long after a misconfiguration occurred, and without evidence you are forced into uncertainty. Uncertainty can lead to worst-case assumptions, broader incident response actions, and more expensive remediation. Evidence also helps you distinguish between a real encryption gap and a misunderstanding, because you can trace what settings were applied, when they changed, and who changed them. A strong posture treats encryption evidence as part of normal operations, not as something assembled only when questioned. When evidence is retained and protected, encryption becomes a defensible control rather than a comforting story. Misconfiguration risk also increases during change because migrations, refactoring, and service adoption introduce new patterns that may not inherit older encryption assumptions. When teams move data from one service to another, there is often a staging period where data exists in two places, and it is easy for one place to have weaker settings. When teams adopt a new managed service, they may assume its encryption behavior matches what they had before, but small differences can create coverage gaps. When teams optimize performance or cost, they might adjust storage tiers, retention policies, or replication methods in ways that change where data is stored and how it is protected. The defensive approach is to treat changes as moments when encryption workflows must be explicitly validated, rather than assuming the workflow remains intact. That does not mean slowing down all change, but it does mean making encryption verification part of the definition of done for change. If encryption workflows are not validated during change, silent gaps are almost guaranteed to appear over time. Another place silent failures show up is in cross-boundary data movement, such as moving data across environments or across organizational units. A development team might copy a production dataset into a lower environment for testing, and even if the copy is intended to be temporary, it can become long-lived. If the lower environment has weaker key boundaries or weaker access controls, encryption may still exist, but the risk profile changes dramatically. Similarly, teams might share datasets with partners or different internal groups, and those transfers can create new storage locations with different defaults. Protecting encryption workflows means making sure boundaries are enforced not only within one environment, but across the paths where data moves. Strong segmentation of keys by environment and by data domain helps here because it limits which systems can decrypt which data. It also forces teams to think about the sensitivity of data before moving it, because the key boundary becomes a visible gate. When boundaries are clear, silent weakening of protection through data movement becomes less likely. Beginners often miss the difference between encryption being enabled and encryption being effective, and that difference becomes very important when misconfigurations are subtle. A service can report encryption enabled, yet still allow public access to the data through misconfigured permissions, which means encryption does not prevent exposure through normal access. A system can encrypt data at rest, yet allow insecure exports that write plaintext to a location outside the protected zone. A workflow can use the right keys, yet allow broad decryption permissions that make key theft unnecessary because anyone with a common role can read plaintext. These are not contradictions. They are reminders that encryption is one control among several, and misconfiguration in any of the related controls can silently reduce the overall protection. The right response is not to distrust encryption, but to design encryption workflows that assume related controls can drift and that therefore require validation and monitoring. When you connect encryption to access control and lifecycle discipline, effectiveness improves and silent failures become harder to sustain. A mature way to protect encryption workflows is to build layered guardrails that prevent insecure states, detect deviations quickly, and make remediation straightforward. Preventive guardrails include enforcing encryption at creation time, ensuring that new resources inherit secure defaults, and limiting who can change encryption-related settings and key policies. Detective guardrails include regular measurements of encryption coverage, key usage patterns, and data movement paths, with attention to anomalies and drift. Corrective guardrails include having clear ownership for responding to findings, clear processes for fixing misconfigurations, and clear evidence of what changed and why. The goal is not perfection, but reliability, meaning the organization can be confident that sensitive data stays within the intended encryption workflow over time. Reliability also means the team can move quickly during projects and incidents without creating hidden encryption gaps. When guardrails are layered, the system becomes resilient against both mistakes and misuse. As you evaluate encryption workflows, it also helps to adopt a mindset of skeptical verification, because the cloud is full of reassuring labels that do not always reflect complete reality. Skeptical verification does not mean assuming everything is broken, but it does mean asking precise questions about coverage, boundaries, and evidence. It means checking that encryption applies to the data and the artifacts that matter, that key policies match your separation and least privilege goals, and that exceptions are rare, documented, and reviewed. It means treating a passing status as a signal to confirm outcomes rather than as a reason to stop thinking. This mindset is especially important for exam scenarios, where the difference between a superficial answer and a strong answer often depends on whether you recognize silent failure modes. When you can explain how misconfigurations quietly disable security and how to defend against them, you demonstrate real understanding rather than memorization. That is the level of reasoning cloud security expects. By this point, the main lesson should feel straightforward even if the topic is serious. Encryption is only as trustworthy as the workflow that keeps it consistent, and misconfigurations are dangerous when they are quiet. You protect encryption workflows by treating them as a chain of decisions across storage, movement, keys, and access paths, not as a single feature toggle. You reduce silent failures by enforcing sane defaults, preventing unsafe fallback behavior, and keeping key and policy permissions tightly governed. You extend protection across the data lifecycle so backups and exports do not escape the encrypted zone, and you pay special attention during change and migration because those are common gap creation moments. You build visibility through repeatable measurements, and you retain evidence so your claims survive scrutiny under audits and incidents. You also connect encryption to identity governance because key usage and data access permissions determine whether encryption is effective in practice. When you do all of that, encryption stops being a hope-based promise and becomes a control you can trust, defend, and maintain over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.